If you think about your house today and think of all the machines that you've got in your house, the washing machine, the cooker, the refrigerator, the hairdryer, anything you care to consider, in a Roman household, particularly the more affluent ones, every single equivalent of that is going to be carried out by a slave.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. How many slaves were there in the Roman Empire? Were they cruelly treated, or was it possible to go on to win fame, fortune, and freedom? And how often, like Spartacus, did they rebel? Here in conversation with Spencer Mizen, Guy de la Bédoyère explores the remarkable and often brutal history of slavery in the world's most powerful empire.
Guy, you wrote an article on slavery in the Roman Empire for the May issue of BBC History magazine. In that, you observed that slaves across the empire were both visible and invisible at the same time. I wonder if you could kind of expand on that. What did you mean by that?
Let's be absolutely clear about the Roman world. Slaves are everywhere, in every context imaginable. They are the prime motive force, the machinery, if you like. Obviously, there are pack animals and things, but if you think about your house today and think of all the machines that you've got in your house, the washing machine, the cooker, the refrigerator, the hairdryer, anything you care to consider. In a Roman household, particularly the more affluent ones, every single equivalent of that is going to be carried out by a slave. You're not going to do the cooking. Slave cooks are doing the cooking. You're not going to be making the beds. The slaves are going to be doing that. You're not even going to be combing your hair. The slaves are going to be doing that. If you're in your bath, there's going to be a slave grooming you. If you want to have things written down, you'll have, particularly if you're a wealthy man, you'll have a slave clerk who is your amanuensis. He will sit there writing things out for you. There are going to be the obviously visible slaves that accompany the wealthy and rich man on his daily business, carrying things around for him. There might be men carrying him in a litter, but he's also going to have the educated elite slaves who are working alongside him. There might be another slave scuttling through the streets, carrying a brazier, bringing his hot food to him. I mean, that's one of the most extraordinary things I think I ever came across about slavery in Rome, is that you've got all these chaps running around holding hot braziers with their master's food to take them to the business and the forum. And you can just imagine that absolutely lethally dangerous. But within the household, there's all those other slaves in the background, in the kitchens, doing the drudge. You've probably got people working on the land, if there is land attached to the house. And then there's also the untold armies of slaves that you don't think about at all. These are the children working in sweatshops, making things, because if you take eyesight, for example, they didn't have anything like reading glasses. Everybody's eyes start to go as you get. Mine started to go downhill in my 30s. I can't do anything without reading glasses now. An awful lot of the manufactured products in the Roman world are going to be made by children in sweatshops, also doing washing clothes, for example, manufacturing untold numbers of objects. There's that. There's also the brutally hard work of slaves working in mines, labouring on a huge agricultural estates. I mean, really, and those are the ones you can just quietly ignore. But even, I think, within the household, I've talked about the visible slaves, like the maid, for example, combing her mistress's hair. Actually, these people are almost totally ignored. Now, I'm going to jump, actually, to some of you may have seen the BBC HBO series Rome and will remember the household of Attia, who is Julius Caesar's niece. Now, she's got slaves in the house, and you do see this really, I think it's actually very good. I mean, Attia gets up to some very personal activities And this is conducted in the front of slaves who are in the room but treated as if they're not there. So even though you've got these visible slaves, there is this paradox. You've got people standing there that you could see them, but they just choose not to see them. They're just ignored.
So is it fair to say then that the Roman society, the Roman Empire, couldn't have functioned without the existence of slavery?
Spencer, I'm going to stick my neck right out and say almost any society until the coming of the Industrial Revolution struggled to exist without slavery or an equivalent. We might not have had slavery in medieval England, but we had peasants who were totally tied to the land and were unable to move off anywhere. Even in Tudor or 17th century England, you've got people who are locked into domestic jobs with very little personal freedom in practice, even if they're theoretically free. It's not until the coming of the machines in the late 18th century that the world begins to find a much more widespread escape from slavery and human misery. Now, we've got an awfully long way to go with that, but yes, it's absolutely true. The Roman world, and let's not vilify the Roman world on its own, because the whole ancient world functioned on slavery. The difference, if there was one, is that the Roman Empire's gigantic level of imperial conquest meant that it had astronomically larger numbers of slaves arriving in booty, and it became a fundamental part of how those involved in Roman warfare, the generals and the senior soldiers, and even to some extent the lesser soldiers, could all profit from the war as when they took a share of the slaves to sell on. Now, this had catastrophic social consequences for the Roman world, not least because lots of ordinary peasants were pushed off their land. This was a very big problem in the Republic during the 2nd century BC. Ordinary peasants were shoved off the land because, as far as senators were concerned, it was more profitable to turn these into huge agricultural estates run by slaves.
So would I be right in saying that slaves then were sourced from all areas of the empire? Once Rome had conquered another part of what would then be integrated into the empire, would slaves then be taken from those areas almost instantaneously?
That is absolutely correct. Slaves were a very large part of the booty of any captured province. There's material like gold and silver and other resources, but human trafficking, yes, absolutely on an astronomical scale, with and a whole industry built around buying and selling them. But let's please not again single the Romans out just to vilify them. There's a very famous instance of a slave in Britain called Regina, who was she's well known because of her tombstone, and she was a Catuvalornian tribeswoman, which means she came from the area north of London, sort of equivalent to Hertfordshire and parts of Essex. Now, it's very easy to, poor Regina, the British woman who enslaved by the nasty Romans. Actually, I'm afraid to say it's much more likely that she was enslaved by her own people and sold into Roman slavery. Now, that's been a facet of slavery right the way up into, what we call modern slavery. It was true of sub-Saharan Africa as well. So, it's an unpalatable side to it, but actually slavery in the Roman Empire was something that, yes, the Romans enslaved the people in the provinces they conquered, but they were dealing with local slave industries anyway. It's just part of it. All leaders and chieftains used slaves as a commodity.
And how were enslaved people bought and sold, and how did Roman citizens go about sourcing enslaved people?
So typically what would happen is that the slaves would be... they may go through a series of middlemen before they actually arrived in a slave market in a city, but we know from inscriptions from Pompeii and Rome or writings about Rome, that there were slave markets, not unlike, some people must have seen those slave posters from the Old South, and antebellum slave posters publicizing the sale of slaves in the southern states of the US. And that's exactly what happened in ancient Rome. So there was notification of of a slave auction coming up. The slaves would be there for sale, and you would be able to go along and inspect them. Of course, what you had to be all the time was very, very careful that you weren't being ripped off, because they were almost like second-hand, the sort of traditional stereotype of the second-hand car salesman. They had all sorts of means of polishing up the slaves. So, for example, they would rub oil into their skins to make them look healthier and better fed. There were various ways of trying to disguise slaves who might have been a little bit older or infirm. And that was a way of trying to unload the slaves onto the market. And you had to go on personal recommendations but you would be going along looking for particular types of slaves. I mean, for example, on one end of the scale, you might be looking for a highly educated Greek who was literate, perhaps a genuine expert, and that is what an educated man, for example, like Pliny the Younger, who was a senator in the early 2nd century AD, and a lot of his letters survive, and he talks about going to slave auctions. And this is a man who had almost the audacity to regard these people, these senior slaves, as his personal friends. I mean, he would socialize with them. I mean, yet they were his property, and he could sell them whenever he pleased.
Do we have any idea of numbers of slaves involved across the empire, and how they compared numerically to actual Roman citizens?
I think it's important to look at the more complex division of Roman society compared to today. Today, we're all supposedly freeborn. Slavery, apart from illegal contexts, doesn't exist for the most part. I mean, yeah, I understand it is a problem. It does exist somewhere, but it's not institutionalized. One thing that we've never had in the modern world, when slavery existed, not even in the United States, was the concept of the freed man. Now, this is a really important concept, because we know that a very significant proportion of people in the Roman world were slaves. It's very difficult to estimate the proportion, but we do know that the Romans were aware that if the slaves knew who each other were, they would realize how many there were, and they could rise up in revolt. And of course they did. There were rebellions, and the most famous one was the Spartacus revolt in 73 to 71 BC, but it was by far and away not the only one. There were lots of others. So the Romans lived in permanent fear of that. Now, what they did, though, was because of the cost of running the slaves, and they were expensive, the Romans had this idea of the freed man, the freed woman. So it was possible for a slave to buy their own freedom or to be awarded it. But that came with all sorts of obligations. The freed man would owe an obligation to his former master in terms of business and that sort of thing. And the master, for his part, would protect him. And so it was all very much like a Godfather situation. I made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and all that kind of thing, and doing each other favors. Or anyone who's watched the Godfather movie will remember how anybody on the Godfather's payroll owes a huge obligation to the Godfather. Well, it's not such a big leap to the wealthy Roman with his slave household, and then these freedmen, people he's freed. They run businesses for him. They will do him favors. They'll act as his political muscle. They'll join gangs and beat up his political rivals. Now, these freedmen dominate trade and industry in the Roman world. So, if you're looking at the proportion of Roman society, not only have you got a very large proportion of people who are slaves, you've got a very large proportion of people who are ex-slaves. And if you go to Pompeii and look at the graves which line the streets outside Pompeii, it's self-selecting. Of course it is, because the wealthier freedmen are the ones who are able to afford tombs. It's amazing how many of those visible tombs are of freedmen and freed women. And they're all over the place. And some of the more extravagant houses in Pompeii we know belonged to freedmen. There's the House of the Betti, for example, two freedmen brothers. They've done very well in business. They have very vulgar paintings all over their walls showing how much interest they had in business. They've got cupids, for example, indulging in all sorts of business transactions. They're actually quite nice to their slaves. They gave their own slaves quite nice quarters, perhaps because they remembered what it was like to be a slave. So, you're not necessarily going to walk into a flash house in Pompeii and assume it belongs to a wealthy freeborn person. It's actually quite likely it belonged to a very wealthy freedman and his wife. There's a woman called Nivolia Teich, and her tombstone is outside Pompeii, and her husband had been a freedman called Munatius Faustus. He'd predeceased her, and his tomb was on the other side of Pompeii. And she obviously decided it wasn't quite extravagant enough. She had her own tomb, which depicted her and her husband handing over largesse to the ordinary people of Rome, and it has a ship on the side, which shows that they clearly made their money out of trade. And it's there parked, towering over the street, so everybody would know who came past what sort of people they were. And my favourite is Euryzakes. Euryzakes was a freedman baker in Rome. He was like a celeb baker, if you can imagine. Imagine a TV series about a celeb baker, serving his bread to the equivalent of Rod Stewart and Kim Kardashian. I suppose that's the sort of thing he did. Anyway, he was so proud of his business that he built his tomb in the form of a bread oven and built it right outside one of the gates of Rome so that absolutely everybody who went past would see that it was his tomb. And it even has a slogan on it, which is a joke to passers-by. He says, it's obvious that this is Euryzakes' tomb because it's all built in the shape of a bread oven. So he's showing it all off. So, they're really conspicuous people.
But was the practice of freeing slaves, is that unique to the Roman Empire in the ancient world?
Freeing slaves has always been possible. I mean, it's always possible to free a slave. It doesn't matter where you are in the ancient world. But in the Roman world, it just depends on the arrangements in any particular place. In the Roman world, it's more formalized. There's an informal way of just a master who could just basically declare that a slave was freed privately, but it's better to be done in writing as a kind of formal manumission. Manumission is the word, and it means to be sent away from, literally, it's to be sent away from the hand. I mean, you're literally being removed from being under the hand of the master. But you had to be very careful that you could prove it, because one thing was that if you escaped, there's lots of slave escapees who would pass themselves off as free, and if they were caught, they could be returned to slavery. That certainly happens to a soldier I can remember. He's actually had a successful military career till it turns out he was a former slave, and he's sent back to being a slave. And incidentally, I might point out that the Emperor Vespasian passed a law which meant that a woman a freeborn woman who chose to have a sexual relationship with a slave would be treated as a slave herself. So, it was potentially quite a tricky situation. But a slave could save up money to free themselves, which is interesting because you wouldn't think they'd be allowed, would you, to accumulate money? But they clearly were in some cases, presumably in the better off households, a little bit of corruption, a few backhanders here and there, essentially copying their masters. And if they got enough money, they could go to the master and buy their freedom, and that's what they did. And then they could become a freedman. Now, the thing about being a freedman, this is such the crucial point. You see, you might be a slave in the Roman world, and then you get to be a freedman, and a freedman can't vote. He can't stand for office. He can be the equivalent of a Roman citizen in a way, and he takes on a Roman citizen's name, but he can't do anything. Now, the freedmen have all sorts of their own offices. They have, for example, the imperial cult that some of them serve as priests on. They have guilds. They have trade guilds that they work in, and they hold positions in them. They're a bit like Masonic outfits. They really are. I mean, they're very hierarchical. They have their own magistracies, etc., and they're kind of freedman substitute. But here's the thing. The freedman's son can stand for office. The freedman's son can vote. So it's a two-stage escape from slavery. Now, that's something that, you can condemn the Roman world all you like, and it's not, it's not ideal. But I tell you, that is a side to slavery in the Roman world you don't really find anywhere else. You can jump. And it means you even reach the point where there are emperors who were descended from slaves. Now, that was never going to happen elsewhere.
Now, Is there any evidence of any Roman citizens actually questioning the morality of slaveholding? Did they at any point think this is not a good thing to be doing?
I think one of the remarkable things about slavery in the Roman world is that when you get any references to it, how incredibly matter-of-fact they are about it. So if I think back to the letters of Pliny the Younger, I don't really see any evidence there that, in him, for example, that he's really bothered about it at all. It's just accepted. But the appearance of Christianity in the Roman world, I think, does start to call this into much wider question, because obviously Christianity operates on a wholly egalitarian individual basis and did not recognize the existence of slavery. And I don't think there's any question about the fact that the proliferation of Christianity throughout the Roman world was undoubtedly going to cause more anxiety about it.
Did enslaved people enjoy any legal protection?
The slaves do have some legal protection, but you couldn't. The masters have all sorts of legal rights about killing or punishing their slaves. I mean, for example, let's start actually with the tremendous vulnerability. Should a slave, for example, attack a master, and it could well be because the master had sexually abused them, if they attack the master and kill them, and we know this to happen, then the law was that all the slaves in the household had to be executed. The whole lot are going to be wiped out absolutely ruthlessly. There are various instances of improvement in a slave's legal entitlement, but it doesn't alter the fact that slavery remains completely institutionalized. So there are limits on arbitrary behavior, but they're pretty conditional.
Now, you mentioned earlier slave rebellions, and the one led by Spartacus being the most celebrated. I mean, can you talk us through a couple of another famous slave rebellions and maybe give us an insight into how that kind of rocked the Roman establishment?
The Spartacus revolt was simply one of a number of slave rebellions which could operate really on quite local on a basis. I mean, there was a long-running slave rebellion in Sicily, for example, and this caused tremendous worry in Rome. The anxiety was that I think the revelation of the number of slaves, the total dependence and reliance on them, the much more worrying thing about the Spartacus revolt, which is really made this the definitively disastrous slave revolt of the Roman period, was that Spartacus appears actually to have been a former Roman soldier, although he was a Thracian. There's slight sort of variation in the records about that. But he ended up being trained, as everybody will remember who's seen the film, as a gladiator. Now, what that meant was, whether he was a soldier or not, he was highly accomplished in the use of Roman weaponry. And his co-gladiators were also similarly well-trained and equipped. And what that meant was that Spartacus was able to lead a rebellion as a military force. And you see, the entire Roman concept of their power was predicated on the notion of the superiority of the Roman army and its ability, by and large, to defeat almost all of its enemies. Now they suddenly find themselves confronted by a slave army, and it's not a bunch of amateurs waving broomsticks. This isn't Dad's army or anything like that. It's pretty well organized and pretty well armed. And to begin with, the Romans are completely complacent about it. It takes them a while to realize just how dangerous this is, which is why in the end Spartacus is able to run riot in Italy for 2 years. And it takes the combined armies of two of the biggest generals of the Roman world, Pompey and Crassus, to defeat Spartacus in 71 BC. And that leaves, a tremendous legacy for the Roman world, having seen that, how dangerous it was. Frankly, actually, the threat never really goes away. I would say that the system of freeing slaves and the access to becoming a freedman and a freedwoman, and your children then being able to be full Roman citizens and to serve, take office and that sort of thing, actually, you can call it cynical if you like, but it's one of the most ingenious and successful devices the Roman world uses to, if you like, alleviates the pressure, the steam pressure, the simmering pressure and resentment. I shouldn't think it ever went away, but as a slave, you're going to have to think to yourself, Do I pull a knife? Do I rebel? Or do I just bide my time, save my money, buy my slavery and give my family a future? Not ideal. By our standards, it's a grotesque choice to have to make. But perhaps that's the better option. And the evidence, I think, is the proof is in the pudding. It's quite clear that a lot of people were freed and did very well out of it, and could see their sons go into office